Chapter 7. Greenwich seemed far enough away from Canary Wharf and ACL for Louise and Barry to relax, even in the company of strangers. Despite his eccentric clothes and brash nature, the doctor inspired a trust that made it very easy for both of them to finally unload the horrors and mysteries of the last 24 hours. Indeed, as they sat in the small cafe opposite the park gates and drank endless cups of coffee, it was difficult for either of them to stop. Louise wondered whether it was the very normality of the situation that made it so easy. Then she decided that it was simply the chance to tell somebody else about what had happened and get the feeling that they believed her. God knows, she had had enough difficulty stopping herself from telling the policeman about it earlier. But the best thing about it was that the doctor, Mel, and Dame Anne Travers, how the hell had she got involved, Louise wondered, appeared to believe them. Barry's description of the transformed computer drew an understanding nod from the doctor, while Louise's account of the death of James Campling was greeted with sympathy and even elicited a gasp of horror from Mel. Their story complete, Barry and Louise sat back as the others presented their own findings. Mel described what she had discovered while hacking into Chapel's network. It was Louise's turn to be shocked, since she would have sworn that Chapel's information warehouse was unbreachable. Mel's description of the programming language in which this codex was written matched that of the module that Barry had stolen, and Louise was impressed, and slightly jealous, when Mel admitted that she had actually understood some of the coding. She then proceeded to write some of it down on a paper napkin. But Louise couldn't help thinking that the effervescent girl was holding back about something, and now the doctor seemed uneasy. "Are you absolutely sure this is what you saw?" he asked, holding up the napkin. Mel looked rather hurt. "I'm not normally wrong, am I?" The doctor shrugged. "Then things have just gone from bad to worse." "What's Chapel up to, then?" muttered Anne Travers. But it seemed to Louise that she was asking the question of herself rather than the others, and she couldn't help suspecting that the woman had an agenda all her own. Louise wasn't looking forward to the time when that agenda clashed with theirs. "What's the significance of this, then?" She realized that Barry was pointing at the scribbled nonsense words on the napkin. The doctor sighed. "Something that needs considerably more investigation before I can be certain." He looked under the table at the slim black shape of a tablet next to Barry's legs. "That's the tablet you liberated from Campling's house, I take it?" Barry nodded. "Then I'd like to borrow it, if I may." "Why not?" said Barry, but Louise wasn't quite as sure. "How do we know that we can trust you?" Mel giggled. "If only you could hear yourself, Louise," she said. "That's one of the oldest clichés in the book. You've got to trust us, haven't you? I mean, who else would sit here and drink coffee with a couple of people who claim that their colleagues are being turned into drooling monsters?" Louise had to admit that Mel had a point. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked the doctor. "Examine, investigate, interrogate," he proclaimed, swinging the tablet from the floor onto the white tablecloth. "Although I can't look for skeletons in Chapel's cyberspace cupboard until this evening, I don't doubt that this little marvel can furnish me with a few answers, even if it does throw up a few more questions into the bargain." "And what are we going to do while you're playing around with that?" asked Mel. I'm glad you asked that," he replied, grabbing her left wrist and reading the time from her gaudy watch. "It's nearly 3 o'clock now. I need to be at Canary Wharf Tower between 11 and midnight to take advantage of my window of opportunity." "And what are we supposed to do until then? Sit and twiddle our thumbs?" Mel sounded very agitated. "We're all part of this now. We do nothing." The doctor clasped his hands together and leant his chin on them. "This situation has now escalated to the point at which I don't want anyone else involved. And that includes you, Mel. I'm not putting any of you at risk, and that's final. But—" "No buts," he snapped. "I have a lot to do, and very little time in which to achieve it. Anne, you have a right to be involved. I'll meet you outside Canary Wharf Tower at 11 p.m. on the dot." "That still leaves us at a bit of a loose end," complained Barry. The doctor sighed. "In the midst of all this ghoulishness, you young people seem to have overlooked 2 rather salient points." He pointed out of the cafe window at the chilly greenery of Greenwich Park. "We are in London, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the galaxy, and today is the 31st of December 1999. He slammed his fist on the table, knocking over the salt cellar. Louise automatically reached over and righted it, picking up a pinch of the spilt salt and hurling it over her shoulder. "I'm sure you can find a New Year's Eve party to go to." He jumped to his feet. "Anyway, people to do and things to see. Dayman, I'll see you at 11. And Mel—" He looked a bit puzzled, but Louise was glad to help him out. "You can come back with us if you want, Mel. I'm sure we can keep ourselves out of trouble while the grown-ups play their games." Mel shrugged. "Well, it's not as if my filofax is full." She briefly considered the invitation and then beamed. "Yes, that would be lovely. Shall we go?" The five of them left the cafe and braved the crisp winds on their way to the nearby taxi rank, just next to Greenwich Market. As they walked, Mel fell back until she was level with the doctor. She still wasn't satisfied with his intentions. "Can't you at least give me some idea as to what you're up to? I don't like the idea of you blundering around without me to look after you." He smiled a warm, avuncular smile. "I'll be fine, Mel. Besides, you were the one who was complaining about missing out on all the fun. Barry and Louise seem nice people, so go and enjoy yourself." Admittedly, she was looking forward to spending some more time with them, but she was still suspicious. "I suppose you're right, but what's really worrying you?" As soon as she had seen the doctor outside Canary Wharf Tower, she had noticed something different about him, a chilling, disturbing something that lay behind his eyes. He sighed and laid a friendly hand on her shoulder. "There's not much I can hide from you, is there? Very well. I'll tell you. Every instinct in me is crying out that Ashley Chapel is tampering with forces that even the Time Lords fear. I might even have to call them in on this one." "That bad?" Her voice was awed. The doctor's normal attitude towards his people was one of disdain. To admit that he could be out of his depth was a terrifying prospect. "Yes, that bad. And I'd feel a lot happier if you were sipping champagne and singing Auld Lang Syne this particular midnight." "Okay, Doc. For once I'll be a good girl and keep out of your way, if it's as important as you say it is." He stopped and stared at the mist and smog-shrouded monument of Canary Wharf Tower. His voice was sepulchral when he continued. "It's the millennium, Mel, the last New Year's Eve of the 20th century, but it's definitely not party time." He smiled as he realized that he had been urging Mel to do just that. "At least for me it isn't." He stopped and placed his hands on her shoulders. "And for once, can't you just do as you're told?" Mel nodded. "For once, Doctor, nothing would give me greater pleasure." With the codex completed, Chapel had even found time to return to his luxury flat in one of the many Docklands condominiums for a change of clothes. He was now dressed in an elegant beige suit, the sheen of the fabric rendering it gold. He sipped a glass of mineral water as he surveyed South London, allowing himself to fantasize about the future that lay before that fine city. In 8 hours, he would run the most important computer program in history and become the new Moses, leading London into the 3rd millennium, the era of peace and prosperity that Sarah Quazell whispered to him in the silent hours. He turned away from the window as the door opened. "Can't you knock?" "Sorry, Ashley." Harker looked abashed, and so he should. His bungling had almost cost them everything. "Just thought you ought to know that the research team will be here at 10. "Excellent. Excellent. I'm still not sure why you need them, though. If the codex is finished—" Chapel sat down on his plush leather sofa and picked up the gold figurine of an antelope from the occasional table in front of him. "David, David, David," he sighed, studying the figurine without even glancing at his head of development. "We stand on the ramparts of destiny, and you bother me with trivia and minutiae." Replacing the antelope, he stood up and walked over to the rear of the office, the wood-panelled and artwork-bedecked wall that hid his secret world. "You have been with me since the beginning, David. You've travelled with me to Egypt, India, Africa, and countries most people haven't even heard of, and stood by and watched as I've scoured ancient libraries and danced with shaman. While I have wrestled with the greater picture, I have left you to deal with the more irritating aspects of our endeavour, such as people and money. And yet I've never once taken you into my confidence regarding the true nature of all this, have I?" Harker coughed, obviously unsure of the correct reply. "No, David, I haven't, and for good reason." He laid a hand on one of the panels. And believe it or not, it has very little to do with trust. He tapped on the panel. It mainly concerns your sanity. A door-sized portion of the wall vanished, revealing a dark area beyond. Chapel looked back at Harker. The man was agog, his mouth hanging open in shock. "You seem surprised," Chapel laughed. "That was simply the appliance of science. What lies beyond in my sanctum sanctorum could be considered to be magic." He entered and beckoned for Harker to follow him. "She's—" Kneeling before the playpen, Mel was at a complete loss as to what to say. Cassandra Mason's face was that of an angel, with hair like spun gold and wide blue eyes that stared through the bars of the playpen with a voracious curiosity. But her problems were obvious at a glance. Her body wasn't just slight, it was withered, with spindly arms and legs attached to a small, doll-like trunk. It looked as if it was an effort for her to support her large head. Mel had been in this situation once before, back home in Pease Pottage. She had been coming out of the cummer shop when old Mrs. Finch had bumped into her, pushing a pram. Mel had immediately peered in, but had been rendered speechless when she had realized that the child was suffering from Down's syndrome. Being unsure as to whether to ignore the child's condition or make some sort of acknowledgement to it, she had mumbled and muttered and smiled pleasantly, inwardly cringing as she read the awkward, hurt emotions on Mrs. Finch's face. Looking round at Louise, she saw exactly the same expression, but Louise didn't walk off in silence like Mrs. Finch had. "The specialists call it Trainer Simpson's malaise." There was none of the shame, none of the begging for forgiveness that Mrs. Finch had shown, even though everyone had understood that it wasn't her fault. A wasting disease, no one's sure, but the general consensus is that it's caused by the rising levels of pollution in the atmosphere. She dragged on her cigarette. Mel couldn't stop herself. "I hope you gave that up while you were pregnant." The looks that shot between Barry and Louise indicated that she hadn't just touched on a nerve, she had wired it into the mains. "I wasn't suggesting," Louise cut her short, holding up a hand. "It's all right, Mel. I didn't give up smoking when I was carrying Cassie, and I'm always going to have to live with the fact that she's like she is. But I'd appreciate it if we dropped the subject, all right?" Mel paused in the silence, the memory of Mrs. Finch vivid in her mind. But Barry came to her rescue. "Anyone fancy a drink?" he said cheerfully. "Have you any herbal tea?" As soon as she said it, Mel regretted being so precious and wondered whether Louise was regretting her earlier invitation. But the reply surprised her. "My God, it's nice to meet someone with taste." She accompanied this with a pointed look at Barry. "Chamomile okay, Mel? I've got some pear and black currant if you prefer." "Chamomile would be lovely, thank you." Louise turned to Barry. "Don't worry, I'll make it," she said, and trotted off to the kitchen. Mel rose from her crouch by the playpen and smiled at Barry. "This is a lovely house." "Lou's very proud of it. Unfortunately, that creature made a bit of a mess." He nodded at the pile of broken china and glass that had been swept into a pile in the corner. "You must enjoy living so close to the West End. All the nightlife." "I don't live here," Barry interrupted. "Lou and I are just friends." "You mean you're not Cassie's father?" Mel felt her cheeks redden at the vehemence of his response. "Whatever gave you that stupid idea? Cassie's father is Lou's business, and you've got no right poking your nose in." "I'm sorry, honestly, I just thought—" "Well, don't think!" He stormed off and stood by the window. Mel bit her lip. She knew that she had a habit of speaking her mind, but she was only trying to be friendly. Deciding that Barry and Louise's recent experiences had made them exceptionally touchy, she forgave herself and followed Barry to the window. "Lovely view, isn't it?" Whereas the house would have once provided a vista of Battersea Power Station, it now looked out upon the staggered pyramid of the Millennium Hall. Despite Anne Travers' objections, which, Mel reminded herself, were based upon her hatred of Ashley Chapel, there was a certain grace and elegance in the alternating light and dark brickwork. "What, that?" Barry seemed to have calmed down since his outburst, but his dislike of the hall was obvious. "Monstrous, if you ask me." Mel decided that his sense of aesthetics had been clouded by his own dislike of Chapel. "It's better than a disused power station." That was a work of art. He scratched his head before pointing at the ziggurat. Well, that's nothing more than a monument to Chapel's ego, if you ask me. Mel had a passing interest in architecture. Who designed it? That's the most ridiculous part of it. With the millions of quid available from the National Lottery, they could have brought in one of the great architects. But Chapel had a hand in it, didn't he? Anne Travers did mention that the Millennium Fund was running a bit short. Barry nodded. And Chapel offered his services and his bank balance to help out. For the public good, of course, he added sarcastically. He brought in some pillock who liked ziggurats to design the bloody thing. He turned away from the window. It's marvellous what you can do when you've got the money, isn't it? Louise chose that moment to come into the living room with the tea and coffee, setting it down on the coffee table. I suppose we ought to work out where we're going tonight? Mel picked up her cup and sipped. Excellent tea, Louise. What about Stringfellows? Barry and Louise looked round in unison. That shut down years ago, said Louise with an odd look on her face. I was thinking more along the lines of Bamaby's or the Colosseum. She caught Barry's surprised look and shrugged. It's not as if we can't afford it, Baz. Catching Mel's own odd look, Barry explained about the generous redundancy payment. Despite her experiences at the hands of David Harker, Mel couldn't help commenting. So he can't be all bad? Barry and Louise stared at one another. Magic? Harker began to wonder whether his boss had started celebrating the new year a bit too early. Chapel laughed, the sound instantly soaking into the rich fabrics which clung to the walls. Call it what you will. Magic, dark science, higher powers. For the last 20 years I've been following a vision, David. A vision of a world where poverty and unhappiness, evil and corruption play no part. He stepped over to the central cone and stroked its rune-covered surface. The 20th century is considered the age of reason, where the gods of science and technology have usurped their supernatural forebears. But what a simpler world it once was. To achieve a fruitful harvest, one sacrificed a goat or some chickens. To punish an enemy, one stuck pins in an effigy. Harker shook his head. Superstitious rubbish. What has this got to do with the Codex? Another laugh from Chapel made him feel decidedly uncomfortable. Everything. It lies at the very heart of this entire project and has driven every single step that we have taken over the last 2 decades. I don't follow. Chapel stared at him, transfixed him. Oh, yes, you do, David. That's all you've ever done. Follow. I employed you for your tenacity and your greed. For as long as you thought you could wrest control of ACL from me, you were the perfect employee, malleable and obedient, as long as it suited your purpose. I've always ensured that the glittering prize of ACL has been just beyond your reach, a lure and a prison that kept you at my side. Did you really think that I wouldn't work out who gave Ms. Bush the protocols she needed to access my systems? Harker began to feel the first icy fingers of fear. The Codex has nothing to do with magic or witchcraft, he blustered, trying not to get into a conversation about Melanie Bush. It's the ultimate computer virus. Really? Sneered Chapel, and Harker could tell that he was toying with him. But why? What the hell was going on? A virus. And at midnight it will infiltrate all the computer networks and systems across the globe. Am I correct? Of course you are. It was Chapel's plan. How could he not be correct? And although Harker was only aware of the purpose of the Codex through the odd system design and email message that he had managed to intercept, his knowledge about it matched Chapel's description. And this oh-so-clever virus, it takes advantage of those poorly maintained software systems whose designers lacked the foresight to ensure that the changeover between centuries was handled seamlessly. Systems that cannot distinguish between the 1st of January 1900 and the 1st of January 2000. Harker nodded. The Codex was designed to enter the great banking systems of the world's stock markets, slipping in during the inevitable confusion that would occur at midnight to wait for instructions. Starting with the London Stock Exchange, the Codex would move around from time zone to time zone, striking at each midnight until it was irrevocably infesting cyberspace. Chapel sighed. Oh, my dear David, you have been naive, he said sadly. Creating such a system would have been child's play for the talents that I've surrounded myself with, and an unimaginable waste of effort. The Codex is infinitely more than just a virus. It is apotheosis. Harker backed away from Chapel, whose voice had taken on an almost evangelical tone. But the program designs... Chapel had moved over to the far side of the room, where a huge statue of the ACL antelope stood against the blue-black drapes. Red herrings, nothing more than will-o'-the-wisps to keep you from discovering the truth. I permitted you to stumble across the odd memo, the odd page of design, just so that you would think that the codex was a computer virus. For Christ's sake, Ashley, what the hell are you going on about? Harker yelled. ACL was a software company, a front for the greatest computer fraud in history. The codex will give us access to every piece of information in any computer across the world. That's what we've been doing. He shook his head. You've really gone off the deep end, he muttered. You're right when you say that ACL is a front, but your limited intellect and even more stunted imagination couldn't even begin to comprehend what I've been doing for the last 20 years. In Africa, I learnt the unspoken truths of the shaman's magic. In Tibet, the secrets of the lamas were revealed to me. In a crypt beneath the Kremlin, the old Russian sigils of power were taken from their silk wrappings and displayed before me. And within the august halls of the Library of St. John the Beheaded, I was privy to the knowledge that now binds all my researches together. He turned from the statue with a fire in his eyes. I have uncovered all that remains of the dark science of the elder gods, true power that has been buried beneath the relentless flow of science and technology. And that dark science has been converted by the university research team, converted from arcane symbols and whispered truths into algorithms and subroutines. The mundane mathematical building blocks that the advanced research team here has transformed into the programming that comprises the codex. That is the truth behind Ashley Chapel logistics, David. You're mad. It was exactly as Harker had feared. The strain of the Codex project had finally got to Chapel. Your eyes are closed to the greater picture, David. He lay both hands on the cone and closed his eyes in concentration. The runes began to burn with red fire. Permit me to open them. A scuttling, scraping noise made Harker spin round to face the doorway, and the sight before him drained the blood from his face. Two creatures, their skin blue-black and inlaid with the same silver and gold pattern as the drapes around the room, were pawing at the floor with the sharp talons on the end of their long, sinewy arms. They looked up at him with slanted yellow eyes and simultaneously opened their drooling mouths to show off their fangs, gurgling as they did so. Introductions shouldn't be necessary, said Chapel, walking round the frozen Harker and stroking the distended head of the creature on the left. You remember Derek and Ivan? Derek Peartree, Ivan Crystal, he whispered. The very same, or rather not. As an added bonus to their severance pay, I have used the merest fraction of my discoveries to grant them immortality, in return for their unswerving obedience, of course. What are they? Chapel shrugged. You'd never be able to pronounce the name given to them by the ancient Mypoboreans who first discovered this particular transmogrification. I like to call them cybrids. And then, with a frisson of menace, he added, I hope you like the name. Why? Because I've decided to reward you for your loyal service over the last 20 years, David. I've decided to grant you the same boon of immortality. No. Harker started backing away. Oh, David, I'm hurt. I was sure that you'd prefer it to another of those damned clocks. The doctor sank back into his chair and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking around the TARDIS laboratory for inspiration. When she had first seen the TARDIS laboratory, Mel had described it as a cross between an alchemist's lair and a ransacked electronics factory. And, sitting at a hastily cleared workbench, the doctor couldn't really disagree, especially since the workbench itself had been a gift from a grateful alchemist. He looked back down at the tablet and sighed. Anyone else would have been disappointed by the contents of the tablet's hard drive, an accounting program, a spreadsheet, and a small word processing package. Nothing that even hinted at alien transformations. But the doctor's search went much deeper, into the operating system itself. And after an intensive few hours spent delving into the system nucleus, the doctor's persistence had paid off. Whatever the operating system present on Campling's tablet, it wasn't Paradigm. At least not the same Paradigm that could be bought over the counter from any software dealer. A clutch of extra modules lurked amongst the innocuous printer and monitor drivers. modules that would have been unintelligible to any human computer scientist. But of course the Doctor wasn't human. The language was so corrupted from the original as to be almost unrecognizable even to him. But certain elements were extremely familiar. He used the cursor to highlight a block of lines near the top of the module, and felt a wave of emotions crash over him as his suspicions were confirmed. One of the emotions was fear at his recognition of the language. The Doctor brushed the feelings aside and carried on reading what he now realized was the syllabic nucleus of a language that had no place in this universe. The words were derived from a tongue that had been both ancient and arcane before the first stars had ignited in the cosmic firmament, before the first protons and electrons had combined in the genesis of the first atom of hydrogen. Words that were only whispered in the darkest corners of the darkest worlds, never spoken aloud. Words of power and majesty that could pluck a quark from the heart of a neutron or rend a quasar asunder. They were words written in a different universe, the cosmos that had existed before the present one, the universe whose death knell had been the birth screams of the here and now, the universe that the Doctor had spoken of to Anne Travers when he had described the origins of the great intelligence. And the words were written in that creature's own secret tongue. The Doctor stood up, feeling the full weight of his 900 years. He was used to the Earth being a world of surprises, a backwater planet that would shape the course of empires. But the pure form of the language in which the module was written was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Time Lord intelligentsia. Indeed, the only reason that the Doctor was aware of the significance of the words was his brief exposure to the Matrix when he had been president of his people. The most powerful tool developed by the Time Lords was block transfer computation, the ultimate expression of mathematics. With it, one could manipulate matter and energy, time and space, and fold dimensions like so much origami. It was the fundamental basis of the TARDIS technology that surrounded him, and had even been harnessed to bleed off excess entropy from the universe, extending its lifespan by incalculable eons. Quantum mnemonics, the dark science of an earlier race of Time Lords, made block transfer computation seem like a conjuring trick. With just a few words, a practitioner of their great art could grasp the basic nature of reality around the throat and shake it into a new configuration. A bon mot of quantum mnemonics could bring about a premature death or a run of good luck. A sentence could transform a planet's history and destiny, changing a world of barbaric war into an Elysium. And a carefully constructed paragraph could rewrite the entire universe, or destroy it utterly. So what was Ashley Chappell doing using the deadliest weapon in creation as part of his operating system? With that frightening thought bright in his mind, the Doctor suddenly became aware of a word in his mind, a name crying out to be listened to. Sarah Quazle. And the earlier events in the TARDIS, previously an annoying blank, were instantaneously revealed to him in all their horrifying detail. But this time he was able to look beyond the stark imagery that the TARDIS had pumped into his mind, and register the results of its analysis of the anomaly that he had detected upon his arrival in London. He left the laboratory at a gallop, running down the white corridors at a speed that would have forced Mel to revise her perception of his fitness level. The readings that the TARDIS had detected earlier indicated that a source of unimaginable energy was hovering above London at a height of approximately 300 feet. But it was frozen energy, frozen at a precise moment of time relative to the Earth's world line like a mathematical bell curve. It built up from nothing, before peaking at its temporal anchor point. And then it trailed away. Without any external interference, the energy was sufficiently out of phase with the rest of reality to pose no threat whatsoever, despite the fact that it was equivalent to the detonation of over 18 billion thermonuclear warheads. It was a phantom, displaced and dispossessed. But quantum mnemonics was exactly the sort of external interference which could summon the energy, especially if it was used at the moment of the energy's temporal anchor, which was in 4 hours' time, midnight, the time that Ashley Chappell was supposed to pull his masterstroke. With a quiver of concern, the Doctor realized that the totally alien body of the great intelligence, pure consciousness, might very well appear to the TARDIS sensors as a massive quantity of potential energy. It looked like Anne Travers's concerns, and those of her father, really were justified. Cursing himself for dismissing her fears as paranoia, the doctor checked the time on the console. It was 9:30, and he was due to meet Anne outside Canary Wharf Tower at 11. But the discovery that Chapel was almost certainly going to summon the great intelligence to Earth meant that the doctor was going to have to rethink his plan. Rather than fishing around in ACL's computer systems, it was now obvious that he would have to confront Chapel directly. And if the intelligence was coming to Earth, the doctor needed to defend himself from it, and he knew just the place to find that sort of defense. As he opened the great doors, he momentarily pondered whether to use the TARDIS to reach his destination. But the knowledge that enough raw power to detonate the Earth's sun was hovering above London was a quite convincing deterrent. The last thing he wanted was for the TARDIS's temporal fields to interact with that. Despite the advanced technology at his disposal and his urgent need to prevent even superior scientific techniques from being used, he only had one choice. Locking the doors of the TARDIS behind him, he hailed a taxi. "Chapel!" The word was spoken in the form of a blinding gold light that burnt only within his mind. Chapel immediately felt the mixture of immense pleasure and unbearable pain that inevitably accompanied communication with Sarah Quazelle, and concentrated as he tried to make out what was being said. Slowly, the gold fire turned into a deep roar, and then the roar resolved into words. The words of Sarah Quazelle. "We are too close to my epiphany for further cybrids to be created. Their corruption could endanger my becoming. Leave this human and destroy the other cybrids in your thrall." At least it sounded like destroy. Sometimes Sarah Quazelle's words were vague and difficult to make out. And then the communication ended, causing Chapel to reel with the emptiness he now felt. Steadying himself against the cone, he pondered the message. When Sarah Quazelle had first directed him towards the Hyperborean texts that described the transformation of human beings into the demons that Chapel had christened cybrids, it had warned that the technique should be used sparingly, explaining that the fundamental nature of the creatures was at odds with Sarah Quazelle's own. Apparently, they were composed of a complex matrix of silicon and spells which could defocus the Millennium Codex if they were present in large numbers, and obviously Harker would have been one too many. Chapel looked at Harker, his body and mind paralyzed by the powers that Chapel could wield. With a brief burst of concentrated thought, he reached into Harker's limited intellect, and Harker nodded and turned to leave, and then paused. "Ashley?" he asked, ignoring the outry trappings of Chapel's sanctum sanctorum. Chapel feigned distraction. "The Codex. It is a computer virus, isn't it?" He sounded uncertain. Chapel laughed and patted him on the shoulder. "Why, David, what else could it be?" After Harker had closed the door. Chapel pondered the cybrids. To assist him in his work, he had created 10 of the creatures. But they were all employees who had served him well over the last 20 years, even Peartree in his own way, and he was loath to kill them like strays. Better to let them run free, he decided, cutting off his mind from theirs. In only a couple of hours, they would be able to experience the rapture of Sarah Quazelle at first hand. The creature that had once been Derek Peartree felt the cessation of control like a fire being extinguished in his mind. The shock was sufficient to cause him to drop the dog carcass that had been hanging from his fanged jaws and look around the landscaped gardens of the Millennium Mall in confusion. The loss of any clear direction was an unbearable thought. For 20 years he had worked at ACL, although that portion of his life was cloudy and difficult to remember. And while the others had been made redundant, Peartree had been personally approached by Ashley Chapel and offered a change in career, confirming Peartree's importance in the scheme of things. The fact that his new job had resulted in a complete physical transformation hadn't bothered him much at the time. At least, it hadn't after it had happened. But at least there had still been direction in his life. But now? Peartree reached out with his mind, but he couldn't contact Chapel, and the realization that he had been thrown onto the scrap heap after all these years of service was a very bitter blow. But whereas the old Derek had sat and wept and bemoaned his fate, his cybrid form was powerful enough to exact revenge on the people responsible. Oh no, this excommunication was nothing to do with him. The blame lay with the people who had disrupted his last project, who had made him look foolish in front of Chapel. That slut, Mason, and her drunken friend, Brown. Casting his mind across London, Pietri located his colleagues. Ivan was at his usual night-time haunt, London Zoo, while Andrew Palmerstone was prowling the South Bank, probably preying on vagrants again. And there was Dean Mowgli, once again visiting the cinemas of Soho and eating the other patrons. Within seconds he had the precise location of all the other cybrids, and then he told them the situation, not in words, for that was far too clumsy a medium, but in vivid images of pure thought. They too were cut adrift from Chapel, and they too felt the same burning anger. And they were more than happy to assist Derek with his latest business proposal. From the banks of the Thames to Regent's Park, the cybrids stirred themselves and set off for Battersea. Looking at her watch, Anne realized that she was supposed to meet the doctor in little more than an hour. But then she looked at the 2 piles of books that sat in front of her and decided that she would have to stand the doctor up. She had spent the entire afternoon and evening in the library of St. John. After once again being shown to the annex by Mr. Atos, Anne's first reaction to her discovery had sent her reaching for the drinks cabinet, the book she had found and hidden. The Many Eyes, Lies and Lives of Yog Sothoth was missing. At first she had assumed that it was back where she had initially found it, replaced by the efficient librarians. But a few minutes of frantic searching had proved only one thing. It was gone. And since Atos had told her when she arrived at the library that only one person had visited that particular annex, she had been able to draw only one conclusion. Ashley Chapel had taken it. Breathing heavily, she had tried to formulate a course of action. From her informant's communiques, she knew that Chapel was planning to act at midnight. And now, he had stolen a book that confirmed his complicity with the Great Intelligence. After 4 years of suspicions, after 4 years of second-guessing Chapel as to why he had destroyed her father's life, she knew the answer. Chapel was in league with Yog Sothoth, the Great Intelligence, and she had only one choice, to repel the intelligence at the same time, at midnight, and her handbag had contained the means to accomplish it. Pushing the doctor's present to one side, she had pulled out her father's stained and crumpled list, and had started gathering the rest of the books that she needed. Now, 7 hours later, she was leafing through one of the books in the pile that was supposed to provide the 6th line of the incantation, but her Latin was far rustier than she would have liked, and her father's instructions as to the location of the precise quote that she required were unusually vague. For a brief moment, a tremor of fear overcame her, undermining her faith in her abilities. And then it was gone, as she cleansed herself with the fire of obsession that had driven her through the last 25 years. But her renewed vigor as she read was disturbed by the sound of approaching footsteps. Her heart pounded as the thought that it might be Chapel occurred to her. Then she realized that Mr. Atos would have warned her if he had entered the library. So who was it? 10 seconds later, the heavy red velvet curtain was drawn aside, and Anne was lost for words. It was the doctor, and he seemed just as surprised. For a few long seconds they simply stared at one another. "Doctor, Anne, what?" And then they laughed, but it was false laughter, since both of them knew what was going on. Anne nodded at the enormous leather-bound book in front of her, more to lighten the atmosphere than anything. "I'm catching up on some reading," she said breezily. It didn't work. The doctor's voice was icy cold. "What are you doing?" "I told you!" He strode up to the table and swept the book to the floor. "Don't come the fool with me, Anne," he yelled. "I know what you're doing, and it's going to stop. Now!" "You hypocritical bastard!" she hissed, standing up and knocking the chair over. "After all you've done over the years, after all the alien invasions that you've lured to Earth, all I'm trying to do is stop the intelligence from corning back." The doctor shook his head. "Anne, you're tampering with forces that mankind is ill-prepared for. To fight Chapel, you're placing this world in even more danger." He slammed his fist on the table. "You're playing with a fire so dangerous you could scorch eternity." She stared at him, and then laughed bitterly. "I really can't believe you said that, Doctor. I really can't." She moved over to the bell pull that hung next to one of the bookcases. "And after that particular piece of hyperbole, it's time you left." She tugged the red silk cord. The doctor became even more desperate. "Anne, you've got to listen to me. It looks like you were right. Chapel is about to summon the Great Intelligence. All I want to do is help you." She shook her head. "You're too late. Doctor, thanks to you, I can repel the intelligence all by myself." She gave her open handbag a nod, and could tell from the doctor's expression that he had seen what was inside. "You're wrong, Anne," he pleaded. "I've seen what's hanging above this city. I've seen how powerful it is. You aren't aware of all the facts. Please, let me help you. Like you did the last time. My father died because you couldn't get rid of the Great Intelligence after it invaded the underground. It came back. It wrought havoc. Or have you forgotten what happened?" The doctor winced. "That isn't fair, isn't it? For all your knowledge and mysterious powers, you seem woefully incapable of preventing the intelligence from attacking this planet, Doctor." Her eyes narrowed. "Or are you and the intelligence connected in some way? It's funny how you always seem to be lurking around when it decides to visit us." Her voice became a venomous whisper. "I was there in the underground when you let the intelligence escape, and then it came back, and my father died." Her words rose to a shriek. "Empty nothings, Doctor. That's all you've got to offer." She waved her hand around the annex. "With the information contained in here, I can destroy that vile, murderous creature once and for all. And I don't need you at all. You don't understand." She reached into her handbag and pulled out the Yeti sphere that the doctor had handed to her in the Dorchester. "As far as I'm concerned, this is the last bit of help I want from you." She looked over the doctor's shoulder at the massive librarian standing in the doorway, the sepia light shining off his bald brown head. "Throw him out," she ordered. "But the doctor is a respected visitor to the library." Mr. Atos appeared behind the librarian. "Is there a problem, Dame Anne?" A hard aspect entered her voice. "The doctor is working for Ashley Chapel, Mr. Atos, and I'd rather he left." Atos turned to the giant and snapped his fingers. "I think the doctor was just about to leave. Mr. Cornelius, would you care to escort him to the door?" "You've got to listen to me," the doctor protested. "You could bring ruin on all of us." "Goodbye, Doctor." Anne turned her back on him and picked the book from the floor. "It's time that mankind relied on itself rather than waiting for the Time Lords to get bored and intervene." The doctor struggled, but even his superhuman strength was belittled by Cornelius, whose corded ebony arms pinioned him helplessly. Atos gave Anne a respectful nod and vanished through the curtain behind Cornelius and the doctor, leaving Anne to continue her researches in peace. Any thoughts of celebrating the new millennium at one of the top London nightclubs had evaporated as Louise and Barry realised how exhausted they really were, and Mel, although obviously disappointed, had agreed that a night in front of the television was preferable to Barry or Louise falling asleep in the middle of a club. Barry had popped out about an hour ago to stock up with drink and nibbles, leaving Mel to keep Cassie entertained while Louise put together some pasta and her extra spicy tomato sauce. After Mel's initial reaction to Cassie, Louise had been surprised by her enthusiasm with her daughter. Every game had been played, every story told, and Louise couldn't help smiling as she listened to them while preparing dinner. And Cassie could hardly keep her eyes open as Louise had carried her upstairs at 9 o'clock, well after her bedtime, leaving Mel to give the doctor a call on her mobile. Indeed, while laying Cassie down in her cot, Louise wondered who had been more disappointed when she had insisted that it was time for bed, Mel or Cassie. It was as she was about to turn off the main light that she had heard something, a scraping, rustling noise, and a cursory glance out of her bedroom window had made her shudder. She was being watched from the back garden. At first she had thought that they were cats, their eyes shining in the faint light from the streetlights. But how many cats had bright golden eyes? And they were higher and bigger than cats' eyes, and the things to which they belonged cast darker, larger shadows that were more human than feline. Louise had watched them for at least 10 minutes, but their unwavering gaze had only confirmed her worries. It was then that she had crept out onto the landing and called for Mel in a broken, unsteady voice. "It's them," Louise whispered, turning back from the window. "I'm sure of it." "Who's them?" asked Mel. "The thing that Derek became. The demon things." Seeing one in Campling's house had been bad enough. The idea that there was a whole pack of them, and prowling round her garden, was more than she could bear. "Aren't you overreacting?" said Mel. "They could be cats," she said dismissively. "That is a rather more feasible explanation, don't you think?" "Is that what you think it is?" Louise snapped. "That my garden's playing host to a Moggies convention?" She inclined her head towards the window. "Take a look. Do they look like cats?" Mel looked out of the window and then shook her head and gulped. "We're safe enough here, aren't we?" And then, with a note of panic, "You did remember to lock the back door, didn't you?" For one terrifying second, Louise couldn't remember. Then she could see herself sliding the bolt across. "Of course I did," she snapped. "We should call the police." "After what happened this morning, for Christ's sake, Mel, what would we say?" "Excuse me, officer, but I've got demons at the bottom of my garden. It's New Year's Eve, Mel. They'd assume we were drunk and forget all about it." She thumped the wall, and then checked Cassie to make sure that she hadn't woken up. "No, we've got to get out of here." They both jumped as a loud banging came from downstairs. "Oh my God, they're trying to get in!" Louise looked from the window to the stairs in panic. "It could be Barry," Mel replied quietly. "Out there with the creatures." That thought was frightening. "Oh God, I hadn't thought of that." And then the banging started again. "We'd better take a look." The women tiptoed down the stairs, Louise cursing herself for never bothering to install a spy hole or a security chain at the front door. As she passed the hat stand, she picked up an umbrella and gave Mel a sheepish smile. "It's better than nothing," she shrugged. Mel stepped forward and whispered through the door. "Who is it?" "It's me, of course," came Barry's familiar voice. "Who else would it be?" Louise sighed with relief and opened the door. "Good evening, Miss Mason. I'm so glad to find you at home." The cybrid grinned malevolently, its spittle dripping onto the welcome mat. "I've always wanted to be invited home,"